The big divide, though, is between those who want to give equal credit to the judeo-christian tradition and to the greco-roman tradition. And what we find, I think, in people who are more culturally conservative and politically conservative is that they will say, yes, we have the Greco-Roman tradition. That's absolutely important to us. You know, it's not accidental that Plato and Aristotle and Seneca and Cicero are cited, and that all of our political architecture is Greco-Roman, and that we do our theater a certain way, and we all know what the Hippocratic Oath is, and we know who Euclid and Archimedes are. So yeah, absolutely. But they will also say equally important is the Judeo-Christian tradition, that there are strongly positive contributions that come out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and that what makes modern Western civilization unique is that it is this hybrid of those two very deep traditions. And I don't agree with that position, but I don't think that's a stupid position. I think that can be a very sophisticated position with a lot of good arguments that can be made for it. The other position says that yes, the Judeo-Christian tradition obviously has been important. The Greco-Roman tradition has been important, but if we're trying to explain the positive achievements of the Enlightenment, the Greco-Roman tradition is more important. And that's the view that I take. Now, the kind of evidence that I make here is that if you look at Europe, the Christians basically had Europe all to themselves for about 1,000 years. And what did they do with it? Well, they start to then say, and this is actually an article I'm working on writing right now, to say, well, you have to talk about scholasticism and the development of universities and this and that and the other invention and so on. I think all of that is true, but if you start putting dates to all of those things, that's 1300s, that's 1400s, right? And all of that is after the Greek and Roman texts are rediscovered and being reintroduced into Europe. So what I think is that that's a lot of now people who are strong fans of the Judeo-Christian tradition making their peace with the modern world, but wanting to get some of the credit for it themselves. So my view is that, it's not to say that everything in Judaism and Christianity is wrong, but as a matter of historical development, that they have been more of an obstacle than an assist in the development. So what had to happen was a brilliant mind like Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s was exposed to the writings of Aristotle that had been recently rediscovered, and his teacher, right, Albert the Great. And with his intellectual integrity and his intellectual honesty, was saying, I think the Judeo-Christian tradition is absolutely right, but I also am very impressed with what the Greeks and Romans did and what this Aristotle guy has come up with, and so let's try for a synthesis. And that's a unique individual that comes along. But it is also important to note that Aquinas was almost excommunicated for trying to do that, and it took a lot of student activism, right, for students who say, no, more Aristotle in the curriculum. Imagine that, right? For the authorities to relent, and so the cat was out of the bag. So I see the Judeo-Christian as fighting a rear guard and then coming to accommodations with increasing inroads of humanism, full-blown Renaissance, and so forth. I do give the Reformation some credit, but I see it as unintended consequences. The early reformers, they hate Aristotle. Right? I mean, you read what Martin Luther has to say about Aristotle, my goodness, hate speech. Yeah, absolutely. But he had a very rich vocabulary, right, shall we say. And the same thing for Calvin, for Zwingli, right, and all of the others. And what they're very much interested in is going back to a purified fundamentalist form of Christianity. From their perspective, now in the 1500s, the church has sold out to Aristotelianism and started to become more worldly, and that's a corruption of Christianity, and we have to get back to true Christianity. But to their credit, right, what the Protestants did say is, we think the Catholic Church is corrupt in this theological way, that the important thing is for each individual to have a direct relationship with God and not to have to go through this institution, right? That God talks to God, who talks to the cardinals, and so on. Or it's captured in Scripture, but Scripture is only available in Latin, and the vast majority of people can't read their own language, let alone Latin. So what the Protestants said, the important thing is for the individual to get a direct relationship with God, and the only way for an individual to do that is to know God's Word, and that means we need to start teaching people to read and to get the Bible translated into all of the vernacular languages. Now, their purpose was not to cause the Enlightenment, but once you start teaching people to read and you start giving them books in their native language, then people start to read the Bible and they start to try to interpret it. And you and I in our Bible studies have different interpretations, and so we start to have arguments about it. And I get better at argument, you get better at argument, and so we start to get more rational. And once people start to get rational and think that evidence and argumentation becomes important, that starts to fit into a certain kind of epistemology that's developing in the early modern world. So the cat's out of the bag, and the Protestants did, to some extent, let the cat out of the bag. Now, fortunately, what we then have is the Protestants are making that contribution. The Catholics did make their accommodations with Aristotelianism, and to this day, they say faith and reason are equally important. Revelation is important, but also Aristotle is very important. So both of them are indirectly contributing. So I do think we can say positively that the Judeo-Christian tradition did add some things as well. But by a large margin, the most important traditions are coming from the Greeks and the Romans as they are reintroduced in humanism and the Renaissance.
One quick follow-up. Jordan Peterson and also the author of the book Inventing the Individual, whose name I can't remember, they both argue, I think, that Christianity and perhaps Judaism as well played an important role in spreading the idea that individuals are divine fragments, that they are made in the image of God, and that notions of the sanctity of the individual, which would lead to the political liberalism prong of your chart,
that's right,
can be attributed to some extent.
Okay, very good. And again, I don't think that is a stupid argument or a bad argument. I think that's an argument that can be very well made. But I don't find it very convincing, because again, for 1,000 years, the sanctity of the individual, right, rested very easily with serfdom, with slavery in many parts of Europe, with the second-class status of women. If you think you take seriously what it says in the Bible, I don't know if there's anything in the Bible that says anything condemnatory of slavery at all. So one mark of the importance of a commitment to the sanctity of individuality does seem to be a kind of repugnance against slavery and other forms of institutionalization. The other thing I would say is you can say the importance of individuality, but that also has to be interpreted the way a strong Judeo-Christian person would interpret it. That what makes you importantly an individual is your soul, it's not your body. Your body really is not that important in the strong versions of Christ. So what happens to your body? Doesn't matter. And that means all kinds of subjugation. So as long as your soul is free. But then, even if we are interested in the importance and the sanctity of the soul, that is complicit in the very long tradition of Christians. Jews are off the hook on this one as far as I know. Christians being willing to torture people for extended periods in order to try to convert them. And the argument is precisely the sanctity of the individual soul argument. If you really care about saving people's souls, that it's so important, what that means is that they have to get the right beliefs about Christianity. And so when you have people who have the wrong beliefs about Christianity and they are close to dying, if they die believing the wrong things, what's going to happen is they are going to burn. And out of Christian love, therefore, you should torture their body and be willing to torture their body, because that's the only way, apparently, you can get them to listen. And maybe it's not that successful, but you might get people's attention enough and get a certain number of people on their deathbed under torture to convert. and therefore you have saved their soul. So that individual sanctity, that is an important principle, but the Christian record on it and how it's interpreted, I think, is subject to lots of writers, both textual and historical. So I would de-emphasize that. Now, that's not then to say that the Greek and the Roman record is any better. So I think there are some original additions that the humanists are coming up with, because as we know, the Greeks and Romans, they were fine with the Greeks especially, with a certain measure of slavery, second-class status of women. The Romans, I think, were a little bit better on both of those things, but the record is not perfect there. What I think you find is the germ of those ideas more seriously taken in the Greek and the Roman tradition, and then what the achievement of many of the Renaissance thinkers, the Renaissance humanists, is to say, wow, the Greeks and the Romans had these ideas, and not to discount the judeo-christian importance of the individual soul either, but then they are taking that and elevating it into a much more universal principle, and then we get to the Enlightenment. As late as the 1670s and 1680s, it's really taking John Locke and others of that generation finally to write a letter concerning toleration, and for the first serious political acts of toleration to be put in place. The Dutch, more informally, had put toleration in place in the earlier part of the 1600s, less on philosophical reasons. It strikes me in the Dutch case it was more pragmatic. You just get sick of all of the religious wars, and let's just say, okay, fine, let's stop all the fighting and get down to business and so forth. But that's late 1600s in Christian Europe.
Just to follow up a little bit on Brandon's question about the individual, sanctity of the individual, the conversation that we were having was regarding my opinion on how the Greeks, for the first time in the history of humanity, represent in art the human being as beautiful, and that specifically is the individual as a divine being. The concept of the best, or what we might call God, or the logos, or which the Christians then pick up the concept of the logos that gets started with the Greeks, is this infinitely complex wonder that we're observing and is staring us in the face, that it could be represented in mankind in art. And it's that when the Christians have the seat of power and they destroy that. Yeah. And it's what's picked up again in the Renaissance, and when the Christians are actually losing power, that they use realism as a point of propaganda to try and it's that thing again that
Sorry, who's using realism as a point of propaganda?
The Christians,
like
the
Catholic
Church.
At what time is this now?
Excuse me?
At what time are we now?
The Renaissance.
Oh, okay, good.
Right, so that there, and it's that, it's specifically that, well, not, those are one of the elements that the Protestants turn away from in North, and so then you have a difference in the Northern Renaissance and the Southern Renaissance. So this was our conversation about it, and
so we do the history of intellectual life through art history, which is a beautiful way to do it. So the first point, yes, is about the significance of Greek art and the statuary that has come down to us. And it is important that what you have in the portrayals of humans is humans as godlike, but also the portrayals of the gods as human-like. So you don't have this radically other conception, or the idea that humans should cower and fall to their knees and press their face to the dirt in the presence of something that is immeasurably greater than they. We can stand straight. Okay, there's a Jordan Peterson reference, right? I guess I gotta have my shoulders back. We can aspire to godlike status, and that the gods and goddesses are often portrayed as just superior human beings, more like So when I'm talking with my students about this, more like the way when you're a 13-year-old, how you look up to your brother or your sister who's 16 or 17. And they are, wow, right, in their power, but you also have a sense that you, with some efforts and some growing, you could be there as well. And that is quite unique in art history. So that, yeah, that valorization and idealization of what is possible for human beings. And it is striking that early Christianity is in some of the more radical sects, we have to be a little more nuanced here for sure, clearly reacting to that, and that they, in a negative fashion, because their view is that the human being is, you know, to use St. Paul's words here, sold into slavery to sin. We are worthless, smutty, grubby. We understand what's good, but we're not willing to do so, and so your proper attitude should be one of self-loathing. And so any sort of Greek and Roman idealization is just going to be a slap in the face, and you're going to want to destroy it. And so there was widespread destruction. And then, as you mentioned, that was picked up again in the 1500s when the Romans take over, because by then the Catholic Christians had made their compromises, and they're starting to do beautiful cathedrals and decorate and paintings and so on. And then to allow all of that, one of the things the Protestants do is they go through and they, you know, they whitewash all of the frescoes, and they destroy a lot of the statuary in an effort to go back to purer Christianity. And there is, in addition to just that humanistic point, there is a kind of a metaphysical, theological point that should also be emphasized here if we're going to talk about art, and that is a point about graven images, that it does seem to be a commandment that thou shalt not make graven images. And on the basis of that, whole fields of art then become metaphysically suspect. And the argument then is, if you are trying to take something that is ineffable, spiritual, supernatural, and capture it in physicalistic form, well, that's a sacrilege. That's a blasphemy, because you can't take something that is so wonderful and special and defile it by representing it in physical form, and certainly it wouldn't then be human form. So I think that's in part why there are not graphic traditions or sculptural traditions and painting traditions in some of the sects of the major Western religions. You know, Judaism has a strong literary tradition, but not much of a painterly or sculpturally tradition, because they take that commandment seriously. The Christians took it seriously for 1,000 years. It was a huge debate in the 1100s about whether, when we're building these great new Gothic cathedrals, we should allow these emerging artists inspired by the Greeks and Romans to start putting Bible stories on the walls. Well, because then these are saints, these are demigods, whatever status the various heroes have. But again, we have this, thou shalt not make graven images, and that does seem a little bit sacrilegious. And the argument that seemed to prevail from my reading of the history of the time is to say, well, we do have all of these, to put it bluntly, illiterate people who are getting bored in the third hour of the priest droning on in Latin, and they're just looking around. We might as well make good use of that time, so maybe we can compromise and have some illustrations of Bible stories, give them something uplifting to look at while they're in church, so then they can absorb some of the messages. But that was seen as a compromise on the theological point, and it's precisely that compromise on that theological point that the Protestants are going to react to and reject a few years later in trying to get back to a purified form. So, yeah, really interesting questions.